There's a very specific mechanism, almost mechanical in its precision, that explains why narcissists so consistently succeed at breaking down people who are, by almost every measure, more perceptive, more emotionally intelligent, and more psychologically self-aware than they are. It shouldn't work. An empath should, in theory, see through manipulation faster than almost anyone. And yet, again and again, some of the most emotionally intelligent people end up the most broken down by exactly the kind of person their intelligence should have protected them from. Today, we're breaking down exactly how this happens, the specific mechanism, step by step, because understanding it is the only real defense against it. Let's start with something counterintuitive that has to be understood before anything else makes sense. An empath's greatest strength is also the exact vulnerability a narcissist learns to target with precision. Empathic perception, deep emotional attunement, an instinct to look for the good in people, a willingness to extend understanding even in the face of confusing behavior. None of this is a weakness in any ordinary sense. It's what makes an empath capable of genuine intimacy, genuine compassion, genuine connection most people never experience. But every one of these traits, examined closely, is also a specific point of leverage, and a narcissist, whether consciously strategizing or simply operating on years of reinforced instinct, learns to press exactly there. The first stage of this mechanism, establishing dependency through selective, overwhelming validation. This isn't the same as ordinary compliments. It's specific, targeted validation aimed directly at whatever an empath has always felt was misunderstood or underappreciated by everyone else in their life. Their depth, their sensitivity, their perceptiveness, the exact qualities that made them feel, for most of their life, slightly out of step with people around them who never seemed to operate at the same emotional frequency. A narcissist identifies this specific wound with remarkable speed and offers, seemingly out of nowhere, exactly the kind of recognition an empath has been quietly starving for their entire life. This isn't accidental generosity. It's the first step in building a dependency, because once someone provides validation, this specific, this targeted, this seemingly rare, an empath's own internal sense of worth begins, gradually, to attach itself to that specific source, rather than remaining internally generated the way it should. The second stage, introducing intermittent withdrawal of that same validation, calibrated precisely to keep the empath working to earn it back. Once dependency has been established, the narcissist doesn't maintain constant validation that would eventually stabilize into something an empath could simply rely on, which defeats the entire mechanism. Instead, the validation becomes unpredictable, withdrawn without clear explanation, replaced with subtle criticism, coldness, or simply diminished attention. This intermittent pattern is far more powerful than constant negativity would be, because unpredictable reward is, according to basic behavioral psychology, more compelling and more addictive than consistent reward or consistent punishment. An empath, already primed to search for the good in people, already accustomed to extending explanation and grace, begins working harder, trying different approaches, searching for whatever might restore the validation that felt so remarkable when it first arrived. The third stage, exploiting the empath's own capacity for self-reflection against them. This is one of the more devastating parts of the entire mechanism, because it turns an empath's greatest strength directly against their own stability. Empaths, generally, are unusually willing to examine their own behavior honestly, to consider that they might be wrong, to take responsibility for their part in a conflict rather than reflexively blaming the other person. A narcissist learns to exploit this willingness ruthlessly, framing every conflict in a way that requires the empath to examine themselves for the cause, redirecting blame with remarkable consistency until the empath's own honest, healthy capacity for self-reflection becomes a tool used entirely against their own sense of reality. This produces something specific and devastating: an increasingly capable, increasingly self-aware person who nonetheless becomes progressively less certain of their own perceptions because their very willingness to consider they might be wrong gets weaponized into a constant, low-grade uncertainty about everything. The fourth stage: isolating the empath from external sources of validation and perspective, not through obvious control, but through a slow, almost invisible narrowing of the empath's world. This rarely happens through dramatic demands to cut off friends or family. It happens through subtler means, the narcissist becoming subtly critical of anyone the empath is close to, requiring increasing amounts of the empath's time and attention in ways that leave less room for other relationships, creating enough ongoing tension or crisis that the empath's energy gets consumed managing it, leaving less bandwidth for maintaining other connections. Over time, without any single dramatic moment marking the change, the empath's world narrows until the narcissist has become, functionally, the primary or even sole source of feedback about reality, which makes every other stage of this mechanism dramatically more effective, because there's no longer an external perspective available to counter the narcissist's version of events. The fifth stage: gradually raising the emotional cost of leaving, specifically by increasing the empath's investment in the relationship at exactly the moments doubt begins to surface. This is one of the more sophisticated aspects of the mechanism because it operates almost as a countermeasure to any growing awareness on the empath's part. The moment an empath starts to notice something is wrong, starts to consider distance or exit, the narcissist often responds with a sudden increase in apparent vulnerability, apparent need, apparent crisis, something that makes leaving feel, in that specific moment, like abandonment rather than self-protection. An empath's deep compassion, their genuine unwillingness to cause harm even to someone who's harming them, becomes the exact leverage keeping them in place, precisely at the moment their own growing clarity should be moving them toward the exit. The sixth stage, and one of the more psychologically complex parts of this entire process, convincing the empath that their own depth and sensitivity, the very qualities that made them capable of genuine love in the first place, are actually the source of the relationship's problems. This reframe is devastating because it doesn't just damage the empath's relationship to this specific person. It damages their relationship to their own fundamental nature. You're too sensitive. You read too much into things. Your emotions are the problem here, not my behavior. Repeated consistently enough over a long enough period, this reframe can produce something genuinely tragic. An empath who begins to distrust their own primary gift, treating their own perceptiveness as a liability rather than the remarkable capacity it actually is, precisely because that capacity, if trusted, would have identified exactly what was happening to them far sooner. I want to say something important about why this mechanism, laid out this clearly, works as consistently as it does across so many different specific relationships, with so many different specific narcissists, on so many different specific empaths. It's not because empaths are somehow deficient in judgment or intelligence. It's because the entire mechanism is built specifically to exploit traits that are, in every other context, genuinely admirable and genuinely valuable: compassion, self-reflection, willingness to see the good in people, deep emotional investment in relationships. This isn't a story about empaths being naive. It's a story about a very specific kind of predation that happens to target exactly the traits that make someone capable of the deepest, most meaningful connection, precisely because those same traits, absent the discernment to recognize when they're being exploited, create exactly the vulnerability a narcissist learns to identify and press against with remarkable precision. I want to be honest about something before we move into the second half of this conversation. Understanding this mechanism in detail isn't meant to produce shame about having been affected by it. If anything, understanding exactly how systematic and precise this process actually is should do the opposite. It should remove the shame that so many empaths carry. The quiet, persistent belief that they should have seen it coming, should have known better, should have protected themselves more effectively. This mechanism works when it works, precisely because it's designed to exploit genuine strengths, not genuine weaknesses, and recognizing that distinction clearly is the actual foundation for everything we'll discuss in the second half of this conversation. And that's exactly where we're headed next. How each of these 6 stages can actually be recognized and interrupted in real time. What genuine, restored discernment looks like once an empath reclaims trust in their own perception, and why understanding this mechanism thoroughly is one of the most powerful forms of protection an empath can carry into every future relationship for the rest of their life. Let's talk about how each of these 6 stages can actually be recognized and interrupted in real time, because understanding the mechanism intellectually, which is what we covered in the first half, only becomes genuinely protective once it translates into something you can actually catch happening while it's still unfolding, rather than only recognizing clearly in hindsight once the damage has already accumulated. Let's walk back through each stage, this time focused specifically on the earliest, most catchable signal, and what interrupting it actually looks like in practice. For the first stage, selective, overwhelming validation targeted at your specific, long-standing wound, the earliest catchable signal is the sheer speed and precision of it. Genuine recognition from someone who's actually taken the time to know you tends to develop gradually, matching the pace of an actual relationship. Validation that arrives remarkably fast, remarkably specific, and remarkably calibrated to exactly what you've always felt was missing from other people's attention toward you, deserves a moment of conscious pause rather than immediate, grateful absorption. This doesn't mean treating every early compliment with suspicion. It means noticing specifically when validation feels almost too precisely targeted, too quickly delivered, before any real, earned familiarity would typically produce it. The interruption here is simple in concept, difficult in practice. Slowing your own emotional investment down to match the actual pace of demonstrated reliability, rather than the pace of how good the validation feels in the moment it arrives. For the second stage, intermittent withdrawal calibrated to keep you working for reinstated approval. The earliest catchable signal is noticing your own behavior shifting specifically around someone's approval, rather than around the actual quality or health of the relationship itself. If you notice yourself working harder, trying new approaches, searching for what might have changed, specifically in response to someone's withdrawn warmth, rather than in response to any actual nameable problem you've identified together, that's worth pausing on directly. The interruption here involves consciously separating your own behavior from someone else's emotional weather, continuing your own consistent, reasonable conduct, regardless of whether their approval has temporarily receded, rather than escalating your effort specifically to chase its return. For the third stage, exploitation of your own honest self-reflection. The earliest catchable signal is a persistent pattern where every conflict, regardless of its specific content, somehow concludes with you as the primary party requiring correction. Genuine, healthy conflict in any relationship distributes responsibility unevenly sometimes, but not with total, unbroken consistency in one direction. If you notice, honestly, that you cannot recall a single disagreement in this relationship that concluded with the other person genuinely, cleanly acknowledging their own primary responsibility, this pattern itself is the signal, regardless of how convincing any individual instance felt while it was happening. The interruption requires something specific, deliberately tracking, in writing if necessary, the actual pattern of how conflicts resolve over time, rather than relying purely on your in-the-moment sense of each individual conflict. because the exploitation of self-reflection depends heavily on each instance feeling isolated and reasonable, rather than being recognized as part of an unbroken, one-directional pattern. For the fourth stage, the slow narrowing of your world, the earliest catchable signal is noticing the specific, concrete decrease in time and energy available for other relationships, not as a vague feeling, but as an actual measurable change you can identify by comparing your life now to your life a year or two earlier. Who did you used to see regularly that you no longer see at all? What activities used to occupy meaningful time that have quietly disappeared? The interruption requires deliberate, active maintenance of outside relationships, specifically during the period when a new, intense relationship is unfolding. Treating this maintenance not as optional, but as a genuine safeguard, precisely because isolation, once it fully sets in, becomes dramatically harder to reverse than it is to prevent in the first place. For the fifth stage, escalating vulnerability specifically at the moment you begin considering distance, the earliest catchable signal is noticing the suspicious timing itself. Genuine vulnerability can arise at any point in a relationship, unrelated to your own internal state. Vulnerability that surfaces specifically, reliably, whenever you've begun pulling back or expressing doubt, deserves scrutiny regarding its timing, independent of whether the vulnerability itself seems genuine in isolation. The interruption here requires a specific discipline, allowing yourself to notice and even feel compassion for someone's vulnerability, while still, separately, continuing whatever process of evaluation or distance you'd already begun, rather than allowing the timing of their crisis to automatically override your own emerging clarity. For the sixth stage, the reframe that turns your own depth and sensitivity into the supposed source of the problem. The earliest catchable signal is the specific target of criticism. Healthy, constructive feedback in a relationship tends to focus on specific behaviors, this particular thing you did in this particular situation. The reframe we're describing here tends to target something much broader and more fundamental. Not a specific action, but your entire emotional nature, your sensitivity itself, your capacity to feel deeply framed as the actual problem requiring correction. The interruption requires distinguishing, clearly and consistently, between feedback about specific behavior, which might sometimes be legitimate, and wholesale rejection of your fundamental emotional nature, which almost never is, regardless of how it gets framed in the moment. I want to talk now about what genuine, restored discernment actually looks like once an empath has moved through this entire process and reclaimed trust in their own perception, because this matters as much as recognizing the original mechanism. Restored discernment doesn't look like becoming suspicious of everyone, doesn't look like withholding the depth and sensitivity that made genuine connection possible in the first place, and doesn't look like treating every future relationship as a potential threat to be defended against. It looks like something much more specific and much more sustainable. Maintaining full access to your own empathic perception and emotional depth, while adding a second, simultaneous layer of pattern tracking that runs alongside it, constantly, quietly, checking whether the 6 stages we've described today are beginning to appear, without that checking ever requiring you to shut down or diminish the actual depth of feeling that makes you who you are. This is worth understanding clearly, because it addresses a fear a lot of empaths carry after an experience like this. The fear that protecting themselves requires becoming someone fundamentally different, someone harder, more guarded, less capable of the exact openness that made them who they were before any of this happened. That fear, while understandable, isn't actually accurate. The most well-protected empaths I've ever encountered aren't the ones who've hardened into suspicion. They're the ones who've simply added this second parallel tracking system, a quiet, ongoing awareness of pattern and timing, running underneath their full, undiminished capacity for depth, warmth, and genuine emotional investment in the people around them. I want to say something important about why understanding this entire mechanism thoroughly functions as such powerful, lasting protection, beyond simply this one relationship or this one specific narcissist. Once you've genuinely internalized these 6 stages, not just intellectually, but through the specific work of learning to catch each one's earliest signal, you carry this recognition into every future relationship automatically, the way you'd carry any other well-learned pattern recognition. You don't need to consciously run through 6 stages every time you meet someone new. The recognition becomes ambient, background, operating quietly alongside your full open capacity for connection, ready to surface the moment any of these specific patterns actually begins to appear in any future relationship, regardless of how convincingly that particular person happens to present themselves. I want to leave you with an image, because I think it captures everything we've walked through across both halves of this episode. Picture a vast, ancient forest, home to a particular kind of bird known throughout its ecosystem for an extraordinary, almost unmatched gift. A song so beautiful, so precisely tuned to the exact acoustic properties of that forest's canopy that it could be heard clearly across distances no other bird's call could reach. This gift wasn't a flaw. It was remarkable, genuinely rare, capable of carrying warning, welcome, and beauty further than almost any other creature in that entire ecosystem could manage. But somewhere in that same forest lived a particular kind of predator, one that had learned, over generations, to recognize this exact bird's song and to imitate a very specific, convincing fragment of it. Not the whole song, which would have been impossible to fully replicate, but just enough of its opening notes to draw the real bird close, curious, drawn by something that sounded, for